Welcome to our class in Chassidus. We're going to be learning this week a beautiful Chassidic discourse from the Rebbe. The name of the Chassidic discourse is called Atem Nitzavim. The Rebbe said this Chassidic discourse on Sunday night of Parshas Nitzavim Vayelech, which is also Chai Elul, in the year Tavshin Lamed Tes, 42 years ago. So again, the Chassidic discourse is based on the opening verse in this week's Torah portion. Incidentally, this year, Parshas Nitzavim is this week, and Parshas Vayelech is the following week. So the opening verse says, Atem Nitzavim Hayoin Kulchem. You're all standing here today, Lifnei Hashem Elokeichem, in front of God, your God, Rosheichem, Shiftechem, the elders of the tribes, and you're standing here to go into the bond with Hashem. Then the Torah continues and it says, in the second Torah portion for this week, not only you are going into this bond, but whoever is here and whoever is not here. And it finishes off and it says that eventually, unfortunately, we're going to go into Galus, but when you come back, it says, V'shav Hashem Elokecha, God will return. So the question is, V'heishiv, it should say God is returning us back. And the answer we know is because when we go into Galus, unfortunately, Hashem goes into Galus with us. Now this Torah portion, Parshas Nitzavim, we always read before Rosh Hashanah. And like the Alter Rebbe points out in the Kutei Torah. Now we know the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov says that this verse of Atem Nitzavim, we're standing here today, that's actually the blessing of Hashem. God is blessing every single Jew on this Shabbos Mevorchim of month of Tishrei, which is basically the last Shabbos in the month of Elul, and He's blessing us with a great month, the seventh month in the Jewish calendar, because we know the Jewish calendar starts with Nisan, and the month of Tishrei is the seventh month. And by Hashem blessing us in the seventh month of Tishrei, this is how we have the power to bless all the other months of the year. So obviously, if this Parsha Atem Nitzavim is referring to a Parsha where we're being blessed by Hashem, and through that we're blessing the whole year, we bless the whole year. So obviously this week's Torah portion, not just an isolated Torah portion, one of many, but it's a general Torah portion which encompasses general ideas. What are the general ideas? The Rebbe explains and he says that the verse says that Atem Nitzavim Hayoim, you're standing, and it says Kulchem, all of you. What does it mean, all of you? It means all the different levels of the Jewish people, all 10 different levels. Rosheichem, Shiftechem, the heads of the tribal leaders, the wood choppers, the water carriers, everybody. Every unique individual, your unique mission in this world, whatever you do, we're all unified together. Why were we all unified together? Because we're going into a bond with Hashem, an eternal bond with Hashem. Why? Because we're going into the land of Israel. And as we know, this Torah portion was said before we went into the land of Israel. So we had to have a bond, create an eternal bond with Hashem, a bond which is specifically before we went into the land of Israel, and specifically what? To accept the Torah. Even though we accepted already the Torah in Chayrev, but here's a unique bond, because it's the bond of Torah that we're accepting before we go into the land of Israel. Now, since, as the Torah says, not only the people that were there did God make the bond, but whoever was not there as well, God included in the bond. So obviously this powerful bond that we made with Hashem before we went into the land of Israel for acceptance of the Torah applies to every one of us in a very, very practical way. So the question is, what is this powerful bond that we made with God before we went into the land of Israel in reference to Torah? How does it apply to us in a practical way? So the Rebbe is going to explain this by an introduction. That we first have to understand the whole idea of going into the land of Israel spiritually. We know we have the land of Israel, that's the physical land. But there's a spiritual component to the land of Israel. And what's that powerful spiritual component of the land of Israel? So the Rebbe brings the verse of the previous Torah portion, and obviously the previous Torah portion blesses this whole week, including in that year it was Chai Elul. This year it's a different setup, the calendar. So the verse says, V'hayu ki sova yelo aretz. It's going to be when you come into the land, referring to the land of Israel. Asher Hashem Elokecha noisen lecha, the land that God is giving to us. So we know there's a powerful teaching of the Baal Shem Tov and he explains this verse, reference to going to the land of Israel on a spiritual level. Now, this teaching of the Baal Shem Tov, the Rebbe says, was taught by the previous Rebbe, that he heard it from his father, the Rebbe Rashab, and he heard it all the way back from the Baal Shem Tov. So it's a reliable and a authentic teaching of the Baal Shem Tov that's traced back all the way to Baal Shem Tov that came through the Chabad Rebbeim. So what does he explain? He says, when you're going to come into the land, what does that mean? So he says, Aretz is a reference to Ratzain, the will of Hashem, or Merutza, God is pleased with us. So you're going to come to the level where God is pleased with us, and we're doing the will of Hashem. So what does the verse continue? In other words, how do we come to that level? I mean, it's pretty intense. We talk about God. God has a will. God should be pleased with us. We're doing the will of Hashem. So he says the reason why that happens is because that's actually a gift from God himself. And it's a gift from God to every single Jew, that we have the power to do the will of Hashem, and God should be pleased with us. So what happens when we reach that level? We're doing the will of Hashem, and God's pleased with us. So we have to do our avodah. The fact that we're doing the will of Hashem, God's pleased, that's a gift. But once we have that, what do we have to do? What's our avodah? V'yashavta. We have to internalize it. We have to take and internalize it and bring it batena into the basket. What does a basket mean? So the Baal Shem Tov explains, we have to take these powerful lights, the will of Hashem. God's pleased with us. It's huge. It's amazing. And we have to bring that oil, that light, and bring it into a vessel. What do we do? The verse continues. We have to go ahead and recognize the idea of hashgacha pratis. Hashgacha pratis means that everything that we do happens by divine providence. Asher yivcha Hashem elokecha, that God chose. In other words, a Jew has to know when he comes to a place, not that he went to the place, but God is taking you. God is running the show. God is leading our life. So if you come to the place, why are you coming there for? If God's bringing you, so why is God bringing you? L'shakein shmoi sham. Our purpose is to spread God and godliness all over. That's the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov of the land of Israel. In other words, to recap in short, what the Baal Shem Tov is saying is, we're going to reach the level of the will of Hashem, pleasing of Hashem, which is a gift from Hashem, so we have to internalize it. We have to internalize it in a way that we have to realize that everything comes from Hashem, and once we realize that, once we realize it, we realize not only that we went somewhere. Hashem is taking us all over, and the purpose is that we should share that mission and that vision. And then the Baal Shem Tov continues on, and he adds a little deeper, and he says that how do we go ahead and publicize God and godliness where we are? That is by making a blessing and reading Psalms. So every time we make a blessing on some food or other kind of blessings, and we read Psalms, that's how we make God revealed into the communities and our families wherever we're at. So that is so far the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov on the idea of Eretz Yisrael, Israel, on a spiritual level. Now the Rebbe brings from the Maggid of Mezrich, who we know was a student, and he actually took over from the Baal Shem Tov, and the Maggid of Mezrich actually translates and gives a different spiritual insight, and we know there's 70 right ways to learn it, different levels. So the Maggid says as follows, when you're going to come to the land, in other words, what land? He's referring to not the land like the Baal Shem Tov said, we come to the will of Hashem. But he says we come to the land, we come to the Eretz Al-Yoina, the high land. What's the high land? Olam Haba, the world to come. In other words, we're going to want to come to the world to come. The goal is not to be in this world. The goal is to get to heaven. We want to go to Olam Haba. We want to go to the world to come. So he says, Asher Hashem elokecha noisen lecha. Every person has a place in the world to come. So we're all going to get there. We're all going to get to the world to come. But the Yerishla, when we get there, we want to inherit it. In other words, we don't have to come back and be reincarnated into this world. So what should we do? We want to have Yeshavta. We want to be able to sit in the world to come forever once we're there. So what should we do that we should merit, that we should get to the land of Israel and we should be able to stay there? So the Maggid of Mizrach explains, "V'lakachta," you should take meirashis from the beginning, from the first. What does that mean from the first? That our first interaction and our first engagement into the physical world and the pleasure of the world should be meirashis from the beginning. What is the beginning? So we all know in the chart of Sfirot, there's many ways to count the beginning, but in this case, the first one is the Sfira of Chachma. And Chachma, as we know, it says in Psalms, Reishis Chachma. Chachma is the beginning. In other words, Chachma represents Kedusha. Chachma represents holiness. That everything in the world that we engage in, our initial interaction, our first perspective should be a Chachma perspective, a Kedusha, a holy perspective. So therefore, what happens then is, everything that we take and everything that we do, we should do it with Hashem's vision, Hashem's glasses. In other words, our yearning should be, we want to have the first, that anytime we engage in something, we should have a godly experience, a chachma experience, a holy experience. And that's why the verse interestingly says, meirashis, from the beginning. It doesn't say rashis, the whole beginning. And why does it say specifically from the beginning? Because the fact is we're living in a physical world. We're living in a materialistic world. However, there is meirashis, this part of it as holy that we can connect to. And that's why it says meirashis from the beginning of kol pri ha'adama, all the produce. In other words, what does produce represent? We know that in the spiritual world, there's doimim, the least amount of energy, inanimate. Then when you go higher, there's tzomeach, things that grow. And then higher than that, more energy is chai, things that are alive, the animal kingdom. And medaber is the highest. So meirashis pri adama means that we should look for the holy sparks in the world of tzomeach, in the world of things that grow. So the goal is to elevate the holy sparks in the world of tzomeach, in the things that grow. Not only do we elevate the holy sparks in the world of tzomeach, but we even bring asher tavi me artzecha. Artzecha is referring to the land, doimim, inanimate. So we elevate not only tzomeach, we also elevate the inanimate objects. In other words, even something that has less godly energy, in those doimim, over there we also want to elevate it. Now, he doesn't mention Bal Chai, going up the ladder. Why is that? So Rebbe says, because the Arizal says, because Chai is much easier to elevate. So he mentions the things that are harder to elevate, which is Seimeach and Doimim. But then he goes on to say, still the Maggid's teaching about elevating the world, bringing the Reishis, bringing the Chachma, bringing the Kedusha into everything. So we spoke about Doimim, we spoke about Seimeach, we spoke about Chai. Not only were we talking about Doimim, Smeach, and Chai, but even spiritual things. Like, for example, Torah. We have to elevate the Torah as well. And that's why it says, Asher Hashem Elokecha noisen lecha, everything Hashem gives you. In other words, everything that we should do, our intent should be, and our thought should be, and our speech should be, that in every part of our speech, everything that comes out of our mouth, even when we learn Torah, every single letter and every single word and every single vowel and every single note that we read from the Torah, we should be penetrated and it should be internalized with godliness. And those in the letters that we're saying, the words that we're saying, the vowels we're saying, the notes that we're saying. And Jared points out, and he says, that's why it's interesting. It says, the samta, you should put all these things that you're gathering, batena, in the basket. Now, literally, tena means a basket, but tena also is made up of 3 letters. Tes, nun, aleph. Tes stands for taimim, the notes. Nun stands for the kudot, the vowels. And aleph stands for the oisios, the letters. And then he doesn't mention the crowns on top of the letters. And the reason is because you don't pronounce the crowns. So there's no point in mentioning the crowns. But when a person behaves in such a way, in other words, everything that we do, Doimim, Tzomeach, Chai, Medaber, learning Torah, and over there, and everything we do, we're going to do with Lakachta Meirashis. We're going to find the Chachma, we're going to find the Kedusha, we're going to find the holiness. Then, V'halachta, we're going to go to the place, Olam Haba, and we're going to elevate everything to holiness, and we'll be able to stay there. And that's why it says, Asher Yivcha Hashem Elokecha, God is going to choose it for you. In other words, L'shakein Shema Yisham, should be able to dwell there, and we'll be able to dwell there forever. And that's why, because we reached such a high level, that we're able to go to Olam Haba, and we're able to stay there, because we elevated the world. So that's why the verse actually begins, V'hoya ki savoy el haaretz. It'll be when you come to the land. V'hoya is an expression we all know of simcha, of joy and happiness. So when you finally get to Olam Haba and you're able to stay there because you did your job in this world by finding the rashist chachma into everything, that's a real reason for simcha, for joy and for happiness. And he finishes off and he says, at least in this chapter, the Rebbe says that we find the Alter Rebbe explains in the Kutei Torah that just like there's the land of Israel in the world, that we elevate the world, so the same thing also we have the land of Israel in time. And what is that? That's Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah also represents, and we'll soon see in detail, the level of Israel. And before that, before we obviously go into the land of Israel, in space, and in time, we have to do our elevation, so we need to have beforehand power to do it. And that's why beforehand we have the Krisus Bris, the eternal bond with Hashem, because Hashem gives us the bond so that we can be successful in our mission. So now this Rebbe is going to explain this on a deeper perspective. And so far we had the two powerful teachings of the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid in our spiritual journey of the land of Israel. But now we're going to go into the land of Israel, and also in time and on a soul level. So the Rebbe explains, and he says, with an introduction, that we know that everything that exists in the world, its source is in Torah. Anything that exists in the world, the makar, the source is Torah. So that's in general. But in our case, in terms of the land of Israel, and also going into the land of Israel, so obviously it has its room in Torah. And like he brings from the Alter Rebbe that explains at length in Torah, in his classical work on Kabbalah and the Parsha, and the Kutei Torah as well, that what is Eretz Yisrael spiritually? Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel spiritually, is referring to Torah Shabbat Peh, the oral law. What's the connection of Eretz Yisrael and the oral law? And the Rebbe explains very simple. Because what does Eretz mean? We already learned before from the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov that Eretz is referring to Ratzain, the will of Hashem. Umerutza, to be pleasing by Hashem. So Eretz represents the will of Hashem. And as the famous teaching in the Chazal tell us, why is it called Eretz? Why is it called land? Sharatasa lases ritzain kaina. It wants to do the Ratzain, it wants to do the will of Hashem. So Eretz Yisrael spiritually represents the will of Hashem. Now, what is the will of Hashem? How do you know what the will of Hashem is? Where is the will of Hashem revealed to us? The will of Hashem is revealed to us in Torah Shabbat Peh, in the oral law. Why is that? Because in order to fulfill the will of Hashem, it's not enough just to learn the written law, the 5 books of Moses, the prophets, and the writings. Because even though we know there's nothing that exists in the Torah, even in the oral law, that's not hinted in the written law. In Hebrew it says, Leka midi deloy remisi b'raisa. There's no such thing as something that's not hidden, it's not mentioned even on a hint level in the Torah. But the fact is, it's only in a hint level. And we know you can have 2 different opinions. And both opinions are correct. But specifically by learning halacha, Jewish law, clear, succinct Jewish law, and knowing exactly what to do in Torah Shabbat Peh, in the oral law, then you can do the will, and you can fulfill and observe the will of Hashem. So in other words, what we're seeing over here is, what is Eretz Yisrael? What is the land of Israel spiritually? It's referring to the oral law. Why? Because what is Eretz Yisrael? The will of Hashem. In order to know in a revealed way what the will of Hashem is, you have to learn Torah Shabbat Peh, and then you can know what the will of Hashem is. So based on this, the Rebbe explains why you had to have the internal bond between God and the Jewish people before we went into the land of Israel, which means practically before we accepted Torah Shabbat Peh. In other words, we had to have the bond before we went to the land of Israel. Israel, we just learned this Torah Shabbat Peh, the oral law, to know what to do, to know the Ratzon Hashem. So before we connected to the Torah Shabbat Peh, the will of Hashem, we had to have a bond. Why is that? And the Rebbe explains as follows. What is the spiritual idea of Torah Shabbat Peh? The oral law. So the Rebbe explains that the oral law is basically the connector between the highest of the high with the lowest of the low. What does that mean? What is the source of every law in Jewish law? The source is Ratzon Elyon, the will of Hashem on high, which is even higher than Chachma. Chachma is ideas, intellect. Halacha goes straight to Ratzon, goes straight to the will of Hashem, which is in Keser. Simple law. What does Hashem want? Boom, that goes straight to Ratzon. And as we know, it says in reference to King David and the prophets, V'habayi imoy, Yud Kei Vav Kei was with King David. And the Talmud explains why, Sha'alacha kamoisai, because the law was like King David. He followed the Jewish law. So you see that halacha law goes very, very high. And it's even higher than the level of Elokim, which is one of the names of God. And even higher than Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim, that they're both correct. Why? Because Elokim Chaim, God of life, which sphere is that? That's the sphere of Bina. Like explained in the different different Hasidic discourses of the Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek, and the third Chabad Rebbe and the Marash, and all the other Chabad leaders that taught mysticism, that Elokim Chaim is Bina. On the other hand, Halacha is all the way in Ratzon, much higher. Now, so on one hand, you're dealing with the will of Hashem Ratzon, but on the other hand, you have a Psak Halacha, Jewish law, practically how to behave in this world. So on one hand, you're telling me, do this, don't do that. But on the other hand, where is that coming from? Not from Bina, not from Chachma. It's coming from Ratzon Elyon. And like the Alter Rebbe explains in Ageres HaKodesh, and he gives a simple parable in reference to doing a mitzvah. When a person does a mitzvah, he says it's like a beam that literally is going from the roof to the floor. So what is a beam? A beam on one hand is touching the floor, and the other hand is touching the roof. So the same thing also when it comes to a mitzvah. A mitzvah is how you behave in this world, but it's connected to the will of Hashem. Well, like the Rebbe says in the language of Kabbalah and Chassidus, it's connecting Soivev Kalalmim, which is the powerful light which does not get penetrated into the world, and the Malik Kalam, the way that godly light comes into the world. So in other words, Halacha unites Soivev and Mamali, the highest to the lowest. Now, so Torah Shal Peh again, specifically Halacha, unites the highest to the lowest. How can you unite the highest to the lowest? And that's why, in order to create that bond from the highest to the lowest, you have to go somewhere which is even higher than everything. And that's the bris. That's the everlasting bond. So in other words, the reason why we had to have the bond before we enter the land of Israel in reference to learning Torah Shal Peh, because Torah Shal Peh has the power to connect to the highest, to Ratzon Elyon, and how we should behave in this world. In order to connect the two, you have to have the powerful Krisus bris that takes place beforehand. So that's the connection between Eretz Yisrael, learning Torah, and the bris beforehand. So based on this, the Rebbe is going to explain also why you need the bond, not only for Torah Shal Peh, but also for our soul. Our souls needed the bond. Why? Because what is the whole idea of a bris, a bond? In other words, you draw in from above intellect and logic. And the reason why you brought from above intellect and logic, that gives it the power that there's not going to be any change. And that's where it's going to stay. Irrelevant what happens. Because if you're dealing with logic, so people have, change of heart, change of mind. But if you're connected to somebody above logic, irrelevant what happens, you're connected. A relationship that's based on logic or reason, the minute the logic and the reason and the interest go away, the relation goes away. But if the relationship is based above logic, just because, it never goes away. So on one hand, a bond is from the highest, off the charts. And because the bond that comes from so powerful, from off the charts, it has the power to unite opposites. Because it's not using it logic. Logic can say, okay, it doesn't work out. But when you connect above logic, everything works out. And like the Rebbe Blinks from the Alter Rebbe and the Kutei Torah, he says that what happens when two people go through the two parts, when you make a bond, like explained in the Torah, what happens is two people become one. It's not like two agree. No, two become one. So the same thing also the Rebbe explains in terms of our soul. In order to unify the depth and the hidden and the concealed part of our soul with the revealed part of our soul, which is two opposites. You have the depth of your soul, the concealed part of your soul, your inner voice, your inner soul, and your revealed soul, which is opposites. So you need to have the krisus bris, you need the bond, the internal bond, which draws in from even higher than the internal and the external soul, and that allows the fusion to take place between the external and the internal soul. So again, you see that when it comes to the soul, you have the internal, the external, and in order for it to stick and to stay stuck and stay strong, you need to bring in the krisus bris beforehand, which is much more stronger and much more powerful. So the same idea the Rebbe says applies when you make a bond in the physical world. On a practical level, before they went into the land of Israel, they needed a bond to go into the land of Israel. Why is that? Because they were going into the land of Israel, Kisava Yalaretz, and they were going literally, the Yerusha, they had to inherit it, the Yeshafta, they had to dwell into the land. So why do they need a bond? And the Rebbe explains very, very simply and very powerfully. Because we know it's brought down in many places. Before the Jewish people went to the land of Israel, they were living in a different world. They were living in Olam HaMachshava. They were living in the world of thought. Or they were living in the world of speech. Land of Israel's reality. So it was technically, it was a downgrade for them. They're leaving the world of thought, the world of speech, and now they have to deal with the limitations of the physical world. And they literally had to go down into the world, and that's the way the Torah describes it, the way the tribes described it. Eretz Yechelas Yishvehi. It's a land that's eating up its inhabitants. We want to remain in the world of thoughts. We want to remain in the world of speech. An idealistic world. Who wants to deal with a real world? But on the other hand, God wanted us to go into the physical world. In other words, He wanted us to connect literally, on one hand, from thought, speech, but then again, get involved in the world. So in other words, how does that happen? So therefore, you have to have before the krisus bris, the eternal bond, a specific bond, besides the bond that already we had in Mount Chayrev. Why? Because after the bond of Chayrev, we still remain the Der Deah. We meant a generation of intellect, knowledge, wisdom, thought, speech. We weren't ready to engage in the physical world. Here was a major shift. We're going into the land of Israel. We have to engage with the physical world. So, and it wasn't just that we have to be there and stay in our mind and our speech. We have to literally get involved into the world. And the goal was that eventually we should be able to say about the land, Toiva ha'aretz moed moed, that the land that we didn't want to go to, we wanted to stay in thought and speech, we should be able to say that the land is good. How can that happen? How do you think people that were connected to God on a level of thought and speech, and bring them into a land, they love the land, and still stay connected? And the answer is, that's why God had to make the krisus bris, the bond beforehand. So the bond created the ability and the opportunity that you can have on one hand machshava and dibur, deal with toiva, aretz, moed, and it should not be a contradiction. That's the power of krisus bris, because it's a much more powerful energy that unites the opposites. And that's why we needed physically the krisus bris before we went into the land of Israel. Now, so the Rebbe said like this: the krisus bris that we had before we went into the land of Israel to unite the opposites, as we mentioned before, it unites the internal and the external soul, unites Teresh Peh, the highest levels to the lowest levels, the will of Hashem down to practicality. So the same thing also, we need a krisus bris for Shana, for time. In other words, what does that mean practically? On Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of the year, that's when we went into the land of Israel in Shana, in time. And every single year, before Rosh Hashanah, like now, this Shabbat before Rosh Hashanah, we need that renewed bond again to create that union of time. Why is that? Never explains like this. What does Rosh Hashanah represent? Rosh Hashanah on one hand represents the completion of our spiritual work, which is huge. Rosh Hashanah represents the completion of human spiritual work. And as we see clearly, what does it say in the Talmud? On reference to Rosh Hashanah, Hashem says, He comes to the Jewish people and He says, Tamalichuni aleichem, make me king over you. In other words, if we are losers, He wouldn't ask us that we should make king over Him. We reached the peak. We reached our complete service to Hashem. Hashem was impressed. He goes, oh gosh, you're my people. Please crown me as a king over you. So on one hand, we're on the highest levels. In other words, the resolution that Hashem takes, that he's going to continue to recreate the world and being king over the Jewish people, happens because of the souls of the Jewish people. As it says clearly, "Mi nimlach," who did Hashem console with? With the souls of the righteous people. And we know it says, "V'amech kulam tzadikim," the whole nation are righteous people. And like the famous teaching of the Maggid of Mizrich in his classical book of the Torah, and he says that when Hashem felt the tainug, the pleasure from the work of the tzaddikim, and he gives an example of a parent that has in his image his young child, and that's basically the image Hashem sees. He's excited and he's passionate about the work of the young child, which is the Jewish people doing on a level of tzaddik. So what happens every single year in Rosh Hashanah, God chooses to be the king over the Jewish people because of the Jewish people. So he reached on one hand the highest level. And because of that, what does Hashem chose to be? Not stay on a high level. He chooses to be king over the world. On one hand, we reach the highest level, but then Hashem chooses to be the king over the world. And from this resolution on Rosh Hashanah to be king, it's not only for Rosh Hashanah, it's for the whole year. And that's why it's actually interesting that Rosh Hashanah is called Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of the year, the head of the year actually. Not Tchila, not the beginning of the year. Rosh Hashanah is called, we call it the beginning, but it's the literal translation, Rosh Hashanah is the head of the year. Why is it called the head of the year? And then it's not called the beginning of the year. So it's brought down in one of the classic Hasidic discourses called Ateres Rosh. So he explains like this. Because what is a head? In the head, you have everything of the body. The hands, the feet, the limbs, the organs, everything is in the head. Now, even when every limb is in its place, the head from its spot operates everything. Why? Because everything has a place in the head. So the same thing also when it comes to Rosh Hashanah. The whole year is somehow housed in Rosh Hashanah. And until it actually affects it in a real way, because on Rosh Hashanah, Hashem decides that he's going to give the world life for us for a whole year. So here you see, you're drawing down from one hand from the highest places, we're on the highest level, and on the other hand, we're bringing down energy for the whole year. Not only that, but the whole idea that a God decides, has a resolution to be king over the Jewish people, that comes when the Jewish people crown God as a king. And the fact is, we know that the Jewish people's source is even higher than Torah. Torah is very, very high source. The source of the Jewish people is even higher. So on one hand, we're source so high, but on the other hand, literally our source, as high as it is, we come down to this world, and we deal with the physical world, and we make a psak din, a ruling of Torah. In other words, a ruling not abstract, but what has to do with practicality. And in order to come to a practical resolution, you have to actually work hard. In order to come to the truth of the truth, you can't just shoot out ideas. You have to get into it. And like it's explained at length in one of the classical Hasidic discourse of Yom Tov Rosh Hashanah that happened on Shabbos from the Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Chabad Rebbe, and also from the previous Rebbe. So you have to come down to this world. So on one hand, you have literally from the highest levels, the neshamas, which are sourced higher than Torah, comes down literally to this physical world to figure out how to, deal with godly issues in this world. So in order to basically create from the highest level down to the lowest level, on all levels, and specifically in time, you need to have the krisis bris. You need the internal bond beforehand, and that gives us the power to unite it. Because when you have the internal bond, then all the Jewish people, as we mentioned, ba'amech kulam tzadikim, all righteous, then we become one with the essence of Hashem, literally just like a bond in a physical way where the highest becomes unified with the lowest. So you see again, the same idea applies on a time level of Rosh Hashanah, that the Am Yisrael, with Neshama Yisrael from the highest level connect to the lowest level, and literally from Rosh Hashanah we create a unity throughout the whole year. And the Rebbe finishes off and he says that by from this powerful bond, general power bond, we're able to draw down good resolutions in reference to learning Torah, observing mitzvos, and praying. Because by us learning Torah, doing the mitzvos and praying, we create Yisrael v'kudsha brichu kul echad, that us, the Jewish people, and God become one. What connects us is learning Torah and praying and doing mitzvahs. And when we do that, when we become one with Hashem, the highest to the lowest, we're able to have a ksiva v'chasima toiva. We're written and we're sealed for a good year. L'shana toiva masuka. We're going to have a good year and a sweet year. And obviously it starts before that in the whole month of Elul. As we know, the month of Elul is Ani l'doidi v'doidi li. I am to my beloved is to me. And especially the Rebbe says, starting from Chai Elul, which we know is the birthday of the two powerful great lights. And on that day, their mazel, their powerful energy is strong. And we know that what was their tachlis, what was their whole purpose, and what was their whole intent? There should be one thing. Yafutzu ma'inasecha chutza, that the wellsprings of mysticism should be shared all over the world. God's wellspring should be all over. Up until chutza, all over. All over means that there's no place in the world where Judaism and godliness and Kabbalah and mysticism doesn't reach. And thank God today, to the effort of the internet and YouTube and all the other mediums, we're able to literally teach Chassidus all over the world. And by learning Chassidus, and by teaching Chassidus, and by living a life of Chassidus, we will merit, as the Rebbe finishes off, Osimar. The master is going to come, which is referring to Melech HaMashiach, the King Messiah, is going to come very, very soon, and in our generation, and we'll all be together in Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh, and God willing, our next class will be in Eretz Yisrael, Ir HaKodesh. It's obviously a powerful Chassidic discourse, our powerful bond with Hashem, which gives us the power and the blessings that we need to bring down the greatest energies of Hashem from the highest places all the way into the lowest places. And as Rebbe finishes off, we'll all merit the greatest redemption for all of us. Have a great and blessed week. Shavua Tov, and happy and healthy, sweet New Year.
Moment of Wisdom. Sub-brief and life-changing moments. Join us. Subscribe to Moment of Wisdom channels on YouTube, Telegram, Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp.